On February 19, 1943, in the scorching Tunisian desert, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood watching American soldiers run for their lives. His Afrika Korps had just sliced through their positions at Kasserine Pass like a blade through paper. Tanks stood abandoned in the sand, artillery pieces were captured before their crews could fire a single round. Entire battalions scattered across 50 miles of chaotic retreat. In just 6 days, the Americans suffered over 6,500 casualties, including 3,000 taken prisoner. That night, Rommel wrote to his wife with quiet satisfaction, "The Americans have not yet learned how to fight." Yet barely 2 years later, a captured German general named Günther Blumentritt sat in a British POW camp and gave a very different verdict to historian Basil Liddell Hart. "We regarded General Patton extremely highly," he said, "as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. His operations impressed us enormously. He even improved on Napoleon's basic tenet of speed. And more speed." 2 very different assessments, one of contempt, one of genuine fear. This is the story of how the battle-hardened German army went from mocking the American soldier to fearing him more than any other Allied troops they faced on the Western Front. The British they called professional and methodical. The Canadians they called ruthless. But the Americans they described with words that carried a different weight entirely. Overwhelming, unpredictable, relentless, and above all terrifying in their firepower. It's the story of one of the most remarkable military transformations in modern history. How an army the Germans dismissed as amateurs became the force they genuinely feared. German confidence had deep roots. Before America even entered the war, German military intelligence had already written off the US Army. In 1939, it ranked 19th in the world in size, smaller than the armies of Portugal and Romania. American factories built cars and washing machines, not tanks and artillery. The nation hadn't fought a major war in over 20 years. Its soldiers were seen as soft, its officers inexperienced, its population divided by class, ethnicity, and politics. Nazi ideology reinforced every prejudice. Hitler believed national strength came from racial purity and cultural homogeneity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodline, possessed an inherent martial superiority. America, by contrast, was a mongrel nation of immigrants from every corner of the globe. Hitler told his inner circle he saw no great future for the Americans. "Everything about their society reveals fundamental weaknesses," he said. "How could such a state hold together under the terrible pressure of modern industrial war?" The memory of 1917 and 1918 seemed to confirm it. American doughboys had arrived late, fought bravely but clumsily, and contributed little to the strategic direction of the war in German eyes. The idea that their sons would be any different seemed laughable. So when American forces finally met the Wehrmacht at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, every German assumption appeared completely vindicated. American command was a spectacular failure. Major General Lloyd Fredendall dispersed his forces across a 30-mile front, left units isolated, and set up his own headquarters in an elaborate bunker carved into a mountainside 70 miles behind the lines. Many of his troops were fresh replacements who hadn't even finished basic training. Rommel attacked with total confidence. His panzers rolled through gaps that should never have existed. Infantry units broke and fled without orders. American tanks burned under the accurate fire of German 88s. The retreat turned into a rout. Omar Bradley later called it probably the worst performance of United States Army troops in their whole proud history. German commanders drew the obvious conclusion: the Americans lacked the hardness and cohesion required for sustained combat. Their material wealth could not compensate for poor leadership and tactical incompetence. Rommel expected future encounters would be just as easy. But even in victory, Rommel noticed something that didn't fit. The Americans were not behaving like a defeated army. They weren't demoralized or passive. Within days, they were already reorganizing with a speed that seemed almost unnatural. Eisenhower quickly relieved Fredendall and sent George S. Patton to take command of the Second Corps. Patton descended on the formation like a force of nature. He demanded absolute discipline with manic intensity. Soldiers who had slouched through Kasserine now stood at attention, wore neckties, polished their brass, and trained harder than ever before. Patton was profane, theatrical, and uncompromising. He understood what Rommel was only beginning to suspect. The men who broke at Kasserine were not yet soldiers, but they could become soldiers faster than anyone in the German high command believed possible. The transformation revealed itself with shocking clarity at Guettar on March 23, 1943, barely 4 weeks after the Kasserine disaster. When 50 tanks of the German 10th Panzer Division advanced confidently through the morning mist, they expected another easy victory. Instead, they ran straight into a nightmare. American mines channeled them into killing zones. Tank destroyers opened fire from concealed positions. Infantry held their ground with discipline that had been completely absent a month earlier. And then the artillery began its terrible work. What the Germans encountered that day was something entirely new. Something that would define American ground combat for the rest of the war. It wasn't just more guns. It was a revolutionary integrated artillery system unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever faced. Any observer on the battlefield, even a single unarmed Piper Cub spotter plane, could call for fire from any battery in range. Fire requests could be passed upward and concentrated with remarkable speed. Time-on-target barrages meant shells from different calibers, and distances arrived simultaneously in one overwhelming storm of steel. German soldiers learned to dread the sight of those tiny Piper Cubs circling overhead, because they knew what followed: sudden, precise, devastating bombardment with almost no warning. At Guettar, the German attack shattered. 30 tanks were left burning. Infantry caught in the open were pinned and slaughtered. Captured German soldiers wept as they told their American captors this was the first time in the entire war they had ever been stopped by artillery and infantry alone, without significant armor support. By May 1943, the war in North Africa was over. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, roughly 3 times more prisoners than the Soviets had taken at Stalingrad. The same Americans who had panicked in February were now accepting German surrenders. German intelligence struggled to explain the speed of the transformation. Rommel himself later wrote with unusual candor, "The Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but it brought rich dividends." Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. What Rommel was witnessing was the emergence of a military system that multiplied the effectiveness of every American soldier far beyond individual skill. At its heart was the most advanced artillery fire control system in the world, developed quietly at Fort Sill between the wars. It allowed the Americans to mass fires faster and more accurately than any other army, including the Germans. Later, the introduction of the proximity fuse made American shells 5 to 10 times more lethal against dug-in infantry by exploding in the air above their positions. German veterans consistently said the same thing after the war. What they feared most on the Western Front was not American tanks or fighter bombers, but American artillery. This system was only one part of a much larger machine. American divisions were fully motorized, their logistics seemed bottomless. Destroyed tanks were replaced within days. Ammunition flowed without end. Close air support could be called in within minutes. And perhaps most dangerous of all, American military culture encouraged rapid learning and grassroots innovation at every level. Nowhere was this more evident than in the deadly hedgerows of Normandy after D-Day. The ancient bocage country turned every field into a natural fortress. German defenders slaughtered advancing Americans in brutal close-quarters fighting. For weeks, the offensive ground to a bloody stalemate. But instead of waiting for orders from above, American units began solving the problem themselves. Tank crews welded steel Rhino hedge cutters from scrap German beach obstacles onto their Shermans. Infantry developed new combined arms tactics. Solutions spread quickly from unit to unit without waiting for official approval. The American Army didn't just tolerate this kind of improvisation, it encouraged it. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra unleashed American combined arms power on a scale that left German survivors in shock. 1,500 heavy bombers carpet-bombed a narrow corridor. The elite Panzer Lehr division was virtually annihilated in hours. When the ground assault followed, the German line collapsed. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap, and swept across France in one of the most brilliant campaigns of mobile warfare in history, covering more ground faster than even the Germans had managed in 1940. The Falaise pocket became a slaughterhouse. Mountains of destroyed vehicles and dead soldiers littered the roads. 10,000 Germans died and 50,000 surrendered. Eisenhower walked the battlefield afterward and said the scenes could only be described by Dante. German commanders who had once dismissed the Americans at Kasserine now struggled to explain what had happened. Even Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, later congratulated Patton on his campaign, saying he would have acted the same way in his place. Hitler's last gamble came in December 1944 with the Battle of the Bulge. He threw his remaining elite SS Panzer divisions against what he believed was the weakest sector of the Allied line, hoping the soft Americans would collapse again. They didn't. Small units held critical positions against overwhelming odds. At Lanzerath Ridge, 18 American soldiers and 4 artillery observers held off 500 elite German paratroopers for nearly 18 hours. At Elsenborn Ridge, American divisions and massed artillery stopped the entire 6th SS Panzer Army cold. At Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne, supported by armored elements, answered the German demand for surrender with one legendary word: nuts. Patton then performed a logistical miracle, swinging an entire army 90 degrees northward through snow and ice to relieve the town. The Battle of the Bulge consumed Germany's last strategic reserves and proved beyond doubt that the American army had become one of the most formidable fighting forces on Earth. German officers respected the British as professional and methodical. They could predict and prepare for Montgomery's set-piece attacks. But the Americans were different. They were unpredictable. They adapted with shocking speed. They combined overwhelming firepower, relentless logistics, and aggressive exploitation of every opportunity. Where the British fought like skilled craftsmen, the Americans fought like a vast learning industrial machine that improved every single month of the war. By the spring of 1945, American forces had crossed the Rhine in strength. German cities lay in ruins. Factories that once armed the Wehrmacht were rubble. The strategic reserves of men and equipment were gone. German soldiers fought on with stubborn courage, but without hope. The men who had broken at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 were often the very same soldiers who stood firm at Elsenborn Ridge and Bastogne, who broke out of Normandy, and who marched into Germany itself. They weren't supermen. They were ordinary Americans from farms, factories, and cities across a vast continent who rose to meet an extraordinary challenge when their moment came. In doing so, they gave the once invincible German army something it had rarely felt on the Western Front: real fear. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like the video. It really helps us continue sharing these important chapters of history. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Let us know in the comments. Did any part of this transformation surprise you? Do you have family who fought in North Africa, Normandy, or the Bulge? We'd love to hear their stories. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive for future generations.